But I think that in the early days of the revolution, he was a leader. Sadly, later he became a dictator.
I see so many amazing things, but the people of Cuba are so oppressed.
Tengo tanto amor por Fidel. Es un santo.
How will history judge Fidel Castro? As a ruthless dictator or a champion of social justice? Fidel Castro was born in the eastern part of Cuba on August 13, 1926. His father, Angel Castro, a wealthy sugar producer, had several illegitimate children, of whom Fidel Castro was one. Fidel has said that this unorthodox arrangement instilled in him sympathy for the marginalized and the poor. Fidel was educated in prestigious private Jesuit boarding schools, where he excelled in sports and was intellectually gifted.
Cuando Fidel Castro se graduó, yo escribí que Fidel Castro es madera de héroe y la historia de su patria un día tendrá que hablar de él.
Fidel followed the typical path of the Cuban elite and began to study law at the University of Havana. Here, he became immersed in student groups and quickly became a student leader. A year later, Castro married Mirta Diaz Balart, who came from a wealthy and politically influential family. Her father paid for their honeymoon to New York City. It was in New York, the center of capitalist finance, that Fidel Castro first read Karl Marx's Das Kapital. He said after reading it, "If you don't eventually come to understand the history of the class struggle, and that some people subjugate and exploit other people, you are lost in a forest, not knowing anything." In 1952, Castro pursued his political ambitions by running for a seat on the Cuban parliament for the Orthodox Party. Here was a man who was born illegitimate and did not take his father's last name until he was 17. He was a man who had had the benefits of wealth and education. He was charismatic and intellectually gifted. He had an extraordinary memory and a deep philosophical belief in the importance of social justice. The 1952 election never took place because Batista staged a coup and seized power. All political parties and constitutional rights were suspended. Fidel began organizing a clandestine opposition group.
Eran gente joven con inquietudes revolucionarias que seguían a Fidel porque lo veían con condiciones de líder.
On July 26, 1953, in an attempt to overthrow Batista, Fidel's opposition group led an attack on the Moncada barracks. The plan was a failure and Fidel was imprisoned. After 2 years, Fidel was released and traveled to Mexico and the USA, where he gained support for the cause of liberating Cuba from Batista. On December 2, 1955, Fidel and 81 carefully chosen men, including Che Guevara, returned to eastern Cuba. Fidel's forces were attacked by Batista, and of the original 82 men, 21 fled into the Sierra Maestra Mountains around Santiago, and thus began the period of guerrilla warfare. Using the mountains as their base, Fidel and his men recruited local farmers. His conversations with these men helped Fidel understand the lives of the Cuban people and molded his political platform. Fidel began a newspaper and a radio station and made sure he was always available to the media, even in English. He understood the power of communication, a tool any leader must master.
Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy.
Fidel's words resonated to the Cuban people who were tired of the corrupt policies of Batista and the way he had allowed his country to become a gambling toy of the United States. Fidel offered hope and a vision for a new social order. His passion and charisma, alongside his promise of change, appealed across all classes of Cuban society. Fidel's time had come. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. 4 days later, after 2 years of guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Maestras, Fidel marched triumphantly into Havana.
I'll never forget that first speech that he gave a few days after he had entered Havana. I was watching on television, but they released a flight of doves, a symbol of peace, but one of the doves fluttered up into the air and landed on his shoulder.
The symbolism of the doves cannot be underestimated. To this day, many Cubans see Fidel as an almost godlike figure, a leader who will always protect and serve them. Revolutions, he said, are not only about winning wars, they are also about transforming society. Capitalizing on his support and bringing together his deep intelligence and the leadership skills so carefully groomed and nurtured in the Sierra Maestras, Fidel spent the next few years putting into action his political vision. In order to finance his new society, Fidel began nationalizing banks and industries, including more than $1 billion worth of American-owned property. The Cuban government now took control of every aspect of a Cuban's life, an act that would eventually work against him. Castro introduced a ration card system where every Cuban was given a month's supply of food at a highly subsidized price. To this day, the ration card still exists, and no Cuban, regardless of where they live or what they do, goes hungry. In 1961, Castro enacted a plan for a national health care system. Health clinics were opened all over the country to serve medically marginalized groups in rural and urban areas, and to this day, Cuba's record on health care is impressive.
Creo que todo lo que tenemos, ¿no?, en relación al desarrollo de la medicina en Cuba es gracias al pensamiento y a la dedicación que ha tenido siempre el comandante.
Perhaps, though, his efforts to provide education to every Cuban, regardless of who they were or where they lived, were the most remarkable and will remain one of his strongest legacies. Across the whole country, police stations were closed and turned into schools, immediately providing thousands of classrooms. In January 1959, it was estimated that 41% of Cubans were illiterate, and Castro, with typical flair and passion, undertook a huge literacy campaign, sending anyone who could read and write into the countryside to teach those who could not. On December 22, 1961, Fidel Castro declared the entire island of Cuba a territory free of illiteracy. This remains an exceptional feat which still holds true today. But Fidel's legacy goes well beyond his island. It is increasingly well known that Cuban doctors are practicing in the poorest communities of Latin America, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa. In the recent Ebola outbreak, Cuba sent more health workers to help control the deadly infection than any other country in the world. It is a little-known fact that Fidel played a pivotal role in ending apartheid and was one of only 5 world leaders invited to speak at Nelson Mandela's memorial. Castro sent 36,000 Cuban troops to Angola because of his commitment to what he has called the most beautiful cause, the struggle against apartheid. It was Cuba's victory in Angola in 1988 that helped break the back of apartheid in South Africa.
Because what he has done for us
Porque lo que Fidel ha hecho por
is
nosotros
difficult to put in words.
es difícil de describirlo con palabras.
Firstly, during the anti-apartheid struggle,
Primero en la lucha contra el
he
apartheid,
did not hesitate at all
no
to give
titubeó
us some
por un
maximum
segundo
support.
en darnos toda la ayuda.
In many senses, Fidel's policies had not only impacted other parts of the world, he had successfully managed to transform Cuban society. But what was the cost to these undeniably admirable achievements? Castro's vision of a just and equal society has come at great expense in relation to individual freedom and human rights. He has silenced his critics, and he does not tolerate dissent. There is no freedom of speech in Cuba, and until recently, no private property or businesses. Ultimately, his policies have driven over 2 million people into exile, many of whom risked their lives for the freedom they had lost.
My parents decided to put both their young children on a boat and for 3 days and 4 nights with a minimal water, minimal food. They decided that doing all of that and the sacrifice at the idea of maybe getting to the United States was worth the risk.
When the Soviet Union withdrew their support of Cuba in the early 1990s, the Cuban economy was left in ruins and it has never really recovered. Salaries remain ridiculously low, with a doctor and a street sweeper each earning about $22 a month. As a result of the embargo, Cuba has not been able to keep up with technological growth, and its industry has suffered. Much of Cuba's arable land lies empty, and today, Cuba imports a large percentage of its food. Whilst every Cuban has a roof over their heads, the housing conditions are substandard, and in many cases, dangerous. But Fidel is still there, the Energizer Bunny that has survived a suffocating embargo and 638 CIA attempts on his life. No one has been able to bring Fidel down. The Cubans in Cuba, despite the enormous hardships they endure, have a deep respect for Fidel, and surely, an important part of his legacy will be the love and pride of Cuba that Fidel has instilled in his people. Was Castro a ruthless dictator? Can you describe a man who has provided food, healthcare, and education to his entire population as ruthless? In the end, perhaps his largest legacy will be that despite all the best intentions, despite living and believing that justice and equality are goals worth fighting for, ultimately, what the world has learned from Fidel Castro is that a pure form of socialism could not work.